Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have author Darrell Hartman, Battle of Ink and Ice. Anything Arctic or Antarctic, I'm in. This book takes a completely different view of it, focuses a lot on the stuff that's going on there, but also how the journalists dealt with all this stuff. It's basically rock stars in the beginning age of newspapers and stuff. Love this book. Great talking to Darrell. I'm going to shut up so we can get to it. Let's go. Here we are, author Darrell Hartman, Battle of Ink and Ice, a sensational story of news barons, North Pole explorers, and the making of modern media. Darrell, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brendan.
All right, now you are an expert on a lot of things, but one of the things I think you're an expert on is your home state of Maine. So, general question, I have not been there yet. If I go, what do I have to see while I'm there?
Well, you asked at a good time because I was just in Maine actually for a magazine assignment doing a travel feature. I was born in Maine. I grew up in Maine. I currently live in New York, but my native state, my favorite state. A lot of people would say the place you have to go in Maine is Portland right now. It's just humming, and especially its restaurant scene is really amazing. It's a slightly different city from when I grew up there, and in a lot of good ways too. So restaurants in Portland, for sure, specifically the brown butter lobster roll at Eventide. It's worth the wait in line that you will have. I also found a new place when I was there reporting the story called Leeward, which makes fabulous handmade pasta and is a great addition to the food scene there. And then a sweet little cocktail bar and restaurant called the Danforth. Those would be my three hits for a great sort of food and drink experience in Portland. The other thing I would plug, I grew up near the Mid-Coast area. People love Southern Maine. A lot of those Boston folks who come up in the summer just descend on Southern Maine and its beaches and whatnot. I think the Mid-Coast area is a little, underappreciated and totally worth going to, specifically the town of Camden, which is beautiful. It's on the sea, but you can hike in the morning and get in a sailboat in the afternoon because Camden Hills State Park is right there. I used to hike those mountains a lot as a kid. And for history nerds, it's got a lot of cool stuff. It's and the St. Vincent Millay, the poet, was there. Camden, Rockland, Rockport, which is sort of a tri-city, tri-town, tri-small town group, has Andrew Wyeth, the famous painter. A lot of his work is there. He painted there. There's a great museum with his work in it and other Maine artists. So a lot of richness in a small area, and it is on the coast, which you probably want to do when you're in Maine.
Literally everything you said was perfect. I'm going to do that. I'm going to leave here. This is going to be over. I'm going to go and start planning that. Now, you mentioned it, right? Like, you're a freelance journalist, do a lot of travel writing. That's literally the job, like, especially for a rom-com or those Christmas movies, right around the Christmas time. Like, a lot of people want to be a travel journalist. What is it actually like? How did you even kind of get into it? And is it as wonderful as everyone says it is?
It's a great job. I'll get to the part of it that I don't like maybe in a second. But yes, I from a young age, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer who traveled. And I've been a freelance writer since 2007. And it is the best thing for educating yourself a little bit on all kinds of different fascinating subject areas. I started my journalism career really at a travel magazine in New York City. I spent 2 years on staff at that travel magazine, and then I went freelance. I thought I'd be travel writing all the time. I actually ended up writing about art, culture, a lot of fashion, more fashion than I ever thought I would do, celebrity, sports, interviewing business moguls and whatnot. So just so rich and varied and diverse, and a great way to take sort of a big bite out of the world and just meet people. You can call people up and they'll talk to you, even if they're pretty busy. That's one of the great perks of being a journalist and getting to write for some of the better publications where people call you right back. The part about it that's less good is just media right now is kind of in crisis, I think. And, the cost of living has obviously gone up in the last 20 or 30 years. The fees that freelance journalists get have either stayed the same or gone down. So it is very hard to make a living doing this full time. That's the bad part. So I went to book writing to get rich.
I've at least talked to enough authors to know that's a tough road, a real tough road. Battle of Ink and Ice, I absolutely loved it. Who came up with the title? Because, I saw the title and I'm like, I haven't read what this is actually about, but I know this is for me. Who came up with it?
I have to take credit for that. That was me. We had a working title when I was pitching the book around, and I knew it was fine, but I wasn't really excited by it. The great thing about books is you work on them for a long time, unlike a lot of journalism pieces. And so I had 2 or 3 years to just sort of germinate on what the title should be. And, this is no lie. I never take naps, but I had just gone into my bed for like the afternoon just to rest and sort of like let my mind take a break. And it freaking came to me.
Well, now you gotta tell me, what was the original one that you weren't psyched about?
It was top of the world we were going with. It's like the North Pole's the top of the world. These New York newspaper guys were building big skyscrapers. There's sort of a thing there, but it was not sticky. It was not punchy the way Battle of Ink and Ice came across to me. So
yeah, I totally agree. This is the right decision. It screams to you. And where'd you come up with the idea? Because I mean, what it is this really amazing amalgamation, right? Because Battle of Ink and Ice, I know the ice part. I love anything Arctic and Arctic and things like that. But a lot of this is about newspapers basically exploding in New York City. Where did you get the idea? And did it start off as kind of these 1-2 punch of newspapers and Arctic exploration, or did they kind of just come together as you're writing?
So I had decided maybe 6 years ago from now that I wanted to write a book because I wanted to really go deep into something. I wanted to spend several years on the same topic, on the same project, as opposed to the sort of much quicker metabolism of journalism, right? And I'd started writing some stuff about historical explorers as a journalist. And I joined this place called the Explorers Club in New York City. This is a wonderful old building. It's a club that's been around for 120 years or so. And they do have an archive there. And so I went to the archivist and I asked her, I said, look, are there any expeditions from the club's past that are kind of documented here that have been overlooked maybe? Might be something there that previous researchers and writers have passed over. And she showed me a few. And I didn't really find much there. So then I kind of did a 180. I'm like, well, what about this North Pole controversy, which was a giant thing, which has been written about several times. And I started looking into that, aware I was not the first person to talk about this. The story was amazing. You just cannot believe the sort of twists and turns this polar controversy takes. I also realized that a lot of this story had to do with the media, beginning with the way these polar explorers needed newspapers in order to get themselves publicity, in order to do fundraising, in order to sort of get the glory they were looking for. And there's really this symbiotic relationship between the newspapers and the explorers, who were kind of proto-celebrities, I would say. I love that angle. It felt very modern to me too, right? Just the way this controversy happened, it had almost like a political component to this debate. It had the celebrity component of these explorers. And while the idea of these fur-clad guys dashing across the ice in their dog sleds and stuff in search of this North Pole, which has no value, that seems kind of old-timey and a little irrelevant in some ways to modern life. The media component felt completely out of Trump-era politics, I thought, just a wild component of the story. The other element, I really liked having the media be prominent in this because I feel very comfortable and interested in that side of the story. The story is largely actually set in New York City, where I lived for 15 years, and it's about the media. I'm not a polar explorer myself. I had to learn. I don't know a ton about Arctic navigation, and I can't use a sextant. So I wanted this to be different from a lot of those other explorer narratives where, for me, it gets a bit in the weeds sometimes about where they went and a bay here and a cove there and a sort of, landmarks and geography. I wanted some of that, but to me, the geography that was just as interesting as the sort of landscape of the hurly-burly of New York City media at the turn of the century. And I do think the connection between that and explorers is very strong and has been kind of overlooked in a lot of these other explorers' tales.
Now, I do want to jump back real quick, and for our regular listeners, yes, there was a little Easter egg. Darrell did reference the Explorers Club that Reed Mittenbuehler talked about on his episode. You guys are friends, and because of that, we're talking today, and thank goodness, because this book is freaking good. But jump into what you just said, too. I could read 10 pages about, what Shackleton packed up for it. Like, I understand that a lot of people would look at that and be like, that's boring as hell, right? So I want to say this and say it for the Arctic nerds. This is a lot of the newspaper stuff, but their egos are just as big as any of the Arctic explorers. And I mean, it's, like you said, it's a lot of the politics we talk about today. Like, there is fake news. Fake news is a part of your book. Let's just talk about how this all came about, right? You cover a lot of these editors, right? And how these newspapers came about. But the time period, late 1800s, very early 1900s, newspapers really exploded around this time. What made this particular time in American and New York history so ripe for this kind of explosion in newspapers?
Yeah, it's hard to get your head around how important newspapers were to culture, I would say, during this time. Obviously, the 1890s, early 1900s was a time before the internet and television. Also, time before radio. So if you wanted to get your news, you basically had to read a newspaper. And in addition, in the 1890s, newspapers were becoming so much more than news. They had sermons, they had cartoons, they had illustrations, they had photography, they had advice columns, they had sports scores. It was just this time when people were getting so much out of a newspaper. And they were also cheap. They were incredibly cheap because the model was changing from subscription and newsstand sales over to advertising. So these big newspapers were actually cheaper than the paper they were printed on. They were losing money and then making it back on the advertising. So it's a rich compendium of stuff, and everyone wanted to read them. You talk about this period of newspapers, you have to mention Joseph Pulitzer, whom we associate with the prizes nowadays. At the time, in the 1880s and into the 1890s, he was totally revolutionizing newspapers and making them brighter, punchier, more exciting, more sensational, more readable, bringing in whole new groups of people who never wanted to really read a newspaper before. They thought they were elitist. They thought they were boring. He changed all of that. Another thing, we did not have movies at this point, right? So newspapers were really entertaining people, especially these massive Sunday editions. You would just get this like heavy pile of newsprint dumped on your front porch or whatever. These were totally central to culture, and they were making a ton of money. So it's a fun time. It's an important time in the history of the media, in my opinion, to write about. And so if you were an explorer or you were anyone, you would get publicity basically by being in a newspaper. You didn't have many other options at all.
The really poignant part when we're talking about this particular subject, you really do a great job of explaining if you got on the train, you needed a newspaper. There is nothing else to do. And then by the time you're kind of getting back off the train, hopefully there's an evening edition. You grab that on the way home, right? And then, again, we're going back to traditional gender norms here. I'm not trying to be, excluding anybody here. But back in the day, the husband was going, he got the two newspapers, and then by the time he got home, he handed it off to his wife, and then she got to read it. And it just became kind of the center of a family life, right? It made it very communal for everybody in the family, basically.
Yes, there's a great stat, which I'm going to approximate it, but in 1900, the average household had 2.5 newspapers a day. And that was because, as you rightly say, a lot of it was being read by the man in the family. He would have one for the ride to the office. He would have one at the office, maybe another one for the club, because men's clubs were a big thing then, and he'd have one for the ride home. And off of the one he brought on the ride home, he also gave to his wife to read. The evening papers developed into this huge phenomenon. There was tons of advertising revenue to be had for these evening papers because the lady of the house read them and would see the advertisements for household products. A lot of cultural change was happening too, because one thing Pulitzer did with his newspaper, The World, was he did realize that more women were beginning slowly to enter the workforce at this time. And he identified quicker than other newspaper publishers did, they were reading newspapers, and he should have some material geared toward women specifically.
There's a couple of other egos. Which one do you want to start with, man? I mean, you have two of the biggest egomaniacs. And I mean, listen, I don't know that I'd want to be friends with them, but damn, they're interesting to read about. Pick one and go.
I got to start with James Gordon Bennett Jr. I mean, there was a part of me that just wanted to write about this guy all the time and make the book about him. For people who don't know who he is, he was the most flamboyant, outrageous character of this newspaper world, and maybe of all the Gilded Age, which has its share of wild characters. His father had started the New York Herald in the 1830s. He had inherited it from his father and had been born into excessive wealth and was a racer of yachts, was a rider of horses. He introduced polo to the United States. He was also sort of a drunken mess among New York high society. He was so rich and he cut sort of a striking figure. And so a lot of his sins with chorus girls were forgiven and whatnot. But there was one moment in 1877 where Bennett sort of famously crossed a line in polite society. And at the time was not really known what had happened because the newspapers had this sort of code of privacy that we don't really acknowledge, we don't have anymore. But basically what had happened is he had sort of staggered drunkenly into this drawing room party one afternoon. And it was in the drawing room of his fiancée. And for whatever reason, Bennett unzipped his trousers and urinated in front of this Victorian room of men and women. And in this case, he had to... He fought a duel as a result of that because he'd outraged some men in that room and then fled to France. And so he's this crazy character to begin with. And then he does something even crazier, which is to manage the biggest newspaper in America by cable from France. He's spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a year sending cables to his editors in New York so that he can keep the Herald coming out. And I guess the other thing that I should mention, Bennett is remembered for having sent Stanley to find Dr. David Livingstone in Africa. So this is the most famous explorer of the period, lost in Africa. No one knows where he is. And Bennett has the idea that he'll just fund an expedition to go find this guy, because if he is found by a Herald correspondent, it's going to make headlines around the world and it's going to bring glory and profits to the Herald. No one had ever thought a newspaper could do this before. Basically, what the Herald is doing is rather than reporting the news, it is going out and making the news by finding Livingstone in Africa. This is the source of that quote that some of your listeners may know, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. That's from the moment when Stanley found Livingstone, met him, brought him these supplies, kind of saved his life, and then brought the story back so that the Herald could tell it. This was a huge success. It actually started an era in which other newspapers, if they had the money, were trying to outfit their own expeditions and do insane things just for the news value of it. It's sort of a fascinating, adventurous moment in the history of newspapers.
Well, Darrell, that just sounds like an amazing amount of ego and spectacle. Certainly there isn't somebody else just like this in New York City at the time that also owns a newspaper, right?
Are you talking about Pulitzer?
Well, Pulitzer, right? But there's plenty going on. And then you got the New York Times.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there. I'm trying to think, is there anybody I could possibly be missing? But there's a lot of people in here.
Yeah. Another colossal ego in this newspaper world is William Randolph Hearst.
That's the guy.
Sorry, slow in the uptake here. His story does not directly overlap with this polar stuff so much, but he had to be a part of the story, right? Because he takes this sensationalistic journalism that Pulitzer brings to New York and turns it up to 11, right? And starts winning this war of the newspapers, forces Pulitzer to turn his up to 11. And this is where you have this sort of yellow journalism moment around 1896, 1897, 1898 that has been written about quite a bit, sort of a seminal moment in the history of American media. And the Journal was credited for years, this is Hearst's paper, the Journal, for having started the Spanish-American War, basically drummed up so much jingoism and sort of bloodthirstiness in the American public that the government had no choice but to go to war. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the Journal really did have all this power. Hearst himself went to Cuba carrying a pistol to participate and to report from the ground. He was highly jealous of Theodore Roosevelt in his sort of grandstanding and wanted to do a bit of it himself. So while Hearst did not fund polar explorers, he was a hugely influential character in this moment of media. And that yellow journalism moment, in a funny way, I think was a big reason that New York Times turned into this unlikely powerhouse.
Well, that was my next question for you. I mean, this is basically a journalistic arms race, and everyone's trying to one-up each other. And then there's the New York Times. It does a few things, but ultimately decides to be, for lack of a better term, boring in the middle of all of this, right?
Oh, very boring. It was widely mocked for being the most boring newspaper in New York. Yet what is happening is it is slowly and surely building a devoted readership and becoming quite profitable and just sort of sneaking up through the ranks, avoiding the notice of all these other rival papers. And by the time they realize, oh, look, the New York Times is actually starting to kill it, it's kind of too late. They're on this new wavelength where they have left. Maybe we should go back a second, Brendan, and I'll talk about Adolph Ochs, who's the man who revived the Times. And I would say in contrast to these larger-than-life sort of lordly personalities of Bennett and Pulitzer and Hearst and some of these other figures, Ox kept a pretty low profile. He was a very ambitious man, hardworking, no doubt, but his personality was just very different. He did not want to be in the spotlight. And part of that was due to the fact, I think, that he was Jewish, and this was a very tough time to be a Jewish person in the public light. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. But it was also part of his personality. He wanted respectability and he wanted success, but he didn't need to be famous. He came from very little. He was the son of Bavarian Jewish immigrants. He grew up in Tennessee. He had to leave school at a young age in order to get a job to support his family. The line of work he chose was newspapers, and he came up through the ranks down in Tennessee, not really as an editor or a writer, but as a printer and as a publisher. And he came to know the business very well. He was successful in Tennessee. And then he came to New York City when he heard that the New York Times was looking for a buyer. And the New York Times at this point had been around a while and it was pretty respected, but it was tanking. You know, it was losing all kinds of money. And a lot of experts in New York City thought it was beyond saving. But Ox came in. No one really paid too much attention to him when he arrived, but he essentially kept at it and talked his way into ownership of the Times.
He bought it almost on a bluff, not fully on a bluff, but I mean, he was moving stuff around and maybe this is over here and I might be able to grab that. I mean, to jump ahead too, he had a lot of stuff to go over. And then the most amazing business decision I've ever heard. They were hurting later on down the line and they said, hey, we're going to have to charge more for the paper. And he went, charge less. And that's
exactly
the New York Times. Like we're talking about all these newspapers. The New York Times is the one that survives this battle royale, right? And one of the biggest decisions that you talk about in here is they made it cheaper to actually make more money and stay alive. Like this Ox is just amazing where you have these big egos, whereas he kept figuring out a way to survive, right?
Yes, he did. He was smart. He was very driven. I think one of the keys with Ox, and you can take this as a general business piece of advice or not, he had no distractions. He lived the times, you know, and these other publishers had distractions. It's one of the things that makes it kind of fun to write about, right? Like Hearst was gallivanting around and he was taking showgirls around New York City and going to parties, but weirdly not ever drinking at parties. And Bennett, as I said, had all these like sporting distractions. He loved eating, he loved drinking, he loved funding balloon races and car races and stuff like that. He was on his yacht half the time, out of communications range with people. Ox had none of those sort of hobbies or pleasures or whatever you want to call them. He focused exclusively on the Times, and that paid off, I would say.
All right, I'm going to transport you back to this time. You have to work for one of them. Who are you going to work for?
That is a great question. You know, the funny thing is, the journalists of this period, I read a lot of their memoirs, the ones who had the most fun and the strongest sort of esprit de corps were the ones who worked for Hearst.
Really?
Yes. So I'll explain why briefly. Pulitzer was insanely demanding, never happy with the job anyone had done. This is one of the reasons his newspaper was so good, but he drove his employees nuts with his demands. And Pulitzer also spent a good portion of his later life on a yacht, micromanaging people from thousands of miles away and driving them nuts. You know, nothing escaped his notice. He was highly critical for all his incredible sort of traits as a public figure and a thinker and a social, you know, an agent of social chains, miserable to work for. Bennett at least was fun sometimes, and you could get in Bennett's good graces for a short period of time and the world would be your oyster. And then he had this funny habit of just always eventually turning against someone, everyone.
And I mean, in a very terroristic style too, like he's living somewhere else, but every now and again he'd just show up. And then God knows what's going to happen. He might be here for a day. He might be here for 3 days. And everything better be exactly how he wants it. Otherwise, you're all fired. If I had to put somebody at the bottom, he goes on the bottom for me.
That's fair. His management style would not be approved of today by the McKinseys of the world. It was completely capricious. He liked sneaking up on people. He had these office spies. He called them his white mice, who would send him cables and telegrams about what was going on in the office. It was kind of like living in a surveillance state. Although half the time he was drunk on his yacht, so he wasn't really surveilling anything. but he could spring to attention at any minute, and people lived in fear of him doing that. So he was also not a nice one to work for. I would say, Ox at the Times was a wonderful boss, a respectable, respecting, polite man who let people do their thing. And like Hearst did, this was nothing but Hearst. Hearst really created job security. He signed people to longer contracts, and they knew they had a future and a career at the Hearst papers. Ox had a similar thing where he really did not ever like to fire people and wanted you to work at the Times for life. So as a journalist in 2023, I'm looking back at this period and saying, Times sounds pretty good. And the Times is still kind of like that today. It really is sort of an institution that keeps people for life. They get very loyal and devoted to it, from what I understand. I have friends who work there. That's its reputation. So the Times had a lot of these wonderful qualities. The only issue with working at the Times is you were allowed zero personal style in your writing. It was supposed to be boring and facts-oriented. So for the writers, for the journalists who sort of wanted to develop their own voice or whatnot, it was not a place you could do that. And they never gave bylines. Your name was never on a story. So as for the individualist who wanted to sort of build a career, it was tougher to do that at the Times.
One additional con for the Times, you never knew if the paycheck was actually going to come through, because it was constantly about to go under. But I don't know if everybody actually knew that, because Ox was also pretty good at making it look like everything was fine. So I don't know.
Yes. Well, that was certainly the case in his first few years. And then it did get on firmer financial footing. He was a great, great borrower of money. I would say one of his talents was for securing the loan and managing it.
All right. So your number one pick. Why?
Yeah, Hearst. Weird to say because so many things I don't like about him, but would have been fun to work for him.
Yeah, just a little bit exciting. I think you'd be probably excited everywhere but the Times, really was what it sounded like.
Well, that's the thing. The Times had this wonderful sort of ethos of professionalism, but the other places were a lot of fun to work. Like we've been saying, that fun came with strings attached. I mean, the Herald was a wonderful paper. It's so much fun to go back and read old issues of the Herald. And it could be fun for a while, but you never knew what Bennett was going to do.
Now, we've talked about these big names. There is one name that's kind of buried in here. I never heard his name before, but he's huge when, dealing with what we deal with now. Arthur Brisbane. Can you just tell me a little bit about him and why we should know his name today?
Well, I love that you picked him. Yeah, he's has just a brief appearance in this story and has utterly nothing to do with the polar side of things. However, in this period, he was the boy genius of the New York City media, and not necessarily in a good way. He was kind of too smart for his own good. He did start out working for Pulitzer at The World, and these publishers had a vision of what they wanted the paper to be, but they needed editors to actually put it into, make it reality on a day-to-day basis. Brisbane was the guy who did that for Pulitzer and then for Hearst. He was really the mastermind of the sort of attention-getting, splashy, sexy, kind of vulgar style of newspapering that came to dominate in the 1890s. I would call him the forefather of tabloid journalism. He had a bunch of interesting innovations at that time, one of which was just the giant headline. These were most in evidence at the Evening Journal during the war in Cuba, the Spanish-American War. And, just one of the tricks he had, he would put certain words in the headline in enormous letters so that as you were walking up to the newsstand, you might see something like "War Declared," taking up basically the whole front page of the paper. And then as you got closer to the newsstand, or maybe just after you had already paid for the paper, you would see they'd inserted tiny words between "War Declared," so that the headline actually read, "War will probably be declared." And his great insight was that people didn't mind this. They thought it was kind of fun. The sort of culture elite of New York City thought this was all trash and terrible for the American body politic, and they wrung their hands about it, and I understand why. But Brisbane had this special touch for the average reader, for the working class reader, that made him very successful and very rich. And he was, for a long time, the highest paid journalist in the country. Hearst threw money at him to keep him around. In later life, he became a columnist, and he was pretty often quoted, right? He had a lot of kind of cynical insights into things like the American reading public and advertising. He basically thought people would swallow anything. I'm not saying he's right or he's wrong. I don't think he's admirable, but he has some wisdom. And he really is a big part of this legacy of mass media. He kind of understood it earlier than a lot of other people did. How do you get attention on things? How do you make money in the media business? And how much can you lie to an extent too? Because the Evening Journal, which he kind of masterminded, was a major generator of fake news, especially during the war in Cuba when there were just some outlandish stories coming out about, Cuban insurgents putting dynamite in the coffee cups of the Spanish generals and Amazonian warriors coming out of the jungle to fight against the evil Spanish colonials, just made up stuff.
So long story short, because of Arthur Brisbane, we have the New York Post. That's what I'm hearing right now. That's why those titles are the way they are.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And not just the New York Post. I mean, I would say News of the World, the ones you see at the grocery store checkout aisle.
Oh, yeah, when you have like the Bat Boy and there's the
Bat
weird,
Boy.
Yes.
Alien invaders and like royal couples breaking up that are absolutely not breaking up. It's like that sort of idea of like, well, we can get away with this, so why not do it? That was the Brisbane mentality in media.
I don't want to get too far into it because especially for anybody who doesn't know about it, like this is the pinnacle of the book, right? This is kind of the payoff is Cook and Peary, right? So just very high level. Long story short, they both said they got to the North Pole. A lot of people said, wait a second. And I always knew that there was this really huge scandal about them going back and forth and everything. But you really dig into, this is when somebody started to figure this out. And then this is when these put these pieces together and everything. What did you think as you were kind of putting this together? Because you do a great job of lining up these two guys. One of them is more likely. If we wanted to say one of them did it, one of them is more likely, but he's also the jerk. Whereas
yes.
One of them, who's a super nice guy, is almost definitely a liar. As you're researching that, is it just a lot of twists and turns for you where you're like, everybody's like, this guy would never lie, but he definitely freaking lied.
No, it's such a great character study. I'm talking about the true story, not my own work. It would be less interesting, in my opinion, if the jerk was also the liar. Here we have a case where it's much more complex. And as I was doing the research, I have an opinion, which I'm happy to share about who made it and who didn't and stuff like that. But what was all, and a lot of people who have researched this are very interested in that question. Did he make it? Did he not? And how do we know? How do we not know? I'm pretty interested in that. But I actually found the way each of these explorers made his case to the public to be fascinating. And they did it in very different ways. So just to give a quick thumbnail on who these explorers were. Robert Peary was the leading American polar explorer of the period. He'd gone to the Arctic multiple times, something like 6, 7, or 8 times, trying to get to the North Pole. He had the backing of these rich New York City millionaires. He was their man because all these funds were privately raised to outfit these expeditions. He was also a Navy man. He was a naval engineer. So he had this sort of combination of government support and private money behind him. He was the establishment guy. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was president, backed him. So Peary was the establishment guy, also kind of a jerk, not charming, very ambitious, made no bones about the fact that he just wanted to win and beat everyone else, and highly competitive, almost like pathologically competitive with other explorers. On the other hand, you had Frederick Cook, much less well-known explorer, had in fact traveled with Peary once in the Arctic early on, and they had begun as friends who sort of respected each other. And of course, later on that completely changed. The contrast here is so fascinating. Cook was the son of German immigrants, whereas Peary was native-born. Neither of them really came from money, but Peary was native-born and had a few more connections. Cook was completely charming in a sort of transfixing way, and a lot of people who traveled with him in the Arctic couldn't say enough great things about how sturdy and steadfast and friendly he looked you in the eyes when he spoke. He listened. He became great friends with and almost like a student of the Inuit people he worked with in the Arctic, whereas Peary kind of treated them like indentured servants, I would say. So all these contrasts, and yet when they both come back from the North Pole, it quickly seemed at the time, especially, but also in hindsight, it's like, there's a good chance Cook made this whole thing up, to an extent. He's the sort of charming liar. And Peary, look, I'm a Mainer. So Peary had this Yankee style where he just said stuff like it was. And a lot of people didn't like that, but he was straightforward. He didn't mince words. And a lot of people have looked at this subject, I think, absolutely hate Peary. I see a couple things I kind of like about him, to be honest. But I would say also that Cook is the fascinating, mysterious, enigmatic character among the two. I think Peary is, you get a decent hold of who he was and what his goals were in life. Cook is just sort of a black box and a puzzle, and one could spend a lot of time just sort of getting into this guy and trying to figure out what motivated him and what of the things he said were true and which ones were not true. It's just interesting.
One of the most fascinating things about this story, and I knew it, but I didn't know it to the detail that you go into it. They're both up there, right? They can't know what the other one is doing, right? And, they come back at different times, so they don't know what each other has done until they're both back. They both do the same game plan, though, where this is my opinion. You got to read the book. There's a lot more details so you can make your own decision. In my opinion, neither of them made it. They both knew they weren't going to make it. So what they did was, I'm going to make sure to leave behind anybody that will be able to say for sure that I didn't make it. So both of them brought people who, Inuit, and in the case of Peary, a black gentleman.
Yes.
They both knew we can control these people. That if these people try and talk back at us, we'll just be like, no, why would we believe them? They don't understand. They're stupid. All it's just racism left and right. But what I find fascinating is that, as you talked about, these are two very different types of people who didn't know what the other one did, but they used the same game plan.
Yeah, that is a good point, because when I think about them, I emphasize the differences. And another was that Peary basically had a military campaign to get to the North Pole. It's very organized, very disciplined, had whole teams of people. Cook went super fast and light, which is one reason Peary and his supporters thought Cook never could have made it, because the technique he was using just never would have cut it. But you're very right to point out that, in fact, the reason this argument went on so long is in part was that each guy was doing what the other was doing. And so if one of them accused the other of screwing up in X regard, it was sort of going to blow back in his face because he had done the same thing, So it's this real tangle. Part of the reason you could write hundreds of pages just on this controversy element of the story, which I don't. That would be too many, in my opinion. But if you think of it as an argument, plain and simple, these guys have planned this out very intricately, and they're being very kind of careful and deliberate about their moves. Other thing, Brendan, to remember is when you're in the Arctic at this time period, you have a lot of time to think about stuff. That's another element to this whole thing. Like many long nights where you're planning what you're going to say when you get back home. Some of that shows up in their diaries. You kind of know what they're thinking about, but other stuff they never really committed to paper, and you just have to guess what they were thinking about.
All right, so I'm going to leave whether or not you think either of them actually made it to the North Pole as the second to last question, but I want to jump back to the newspapers, because newspapers build this all up, right? This is now the biggest thing. And I know you mentioned at least one of these editors thought it was better that there was the controversy. Because if one of them actually got the poll and there was just no question about it, it would be a story. But they all must have been licking their chops, because now that there's a controversy and there's mud being slung, it just took on a life of its own how long were people talking about this? How long was this front page news?
This was front page news for 4 months. Beginning when Cook came back on September 1st is when he sent the story to the Herald, and ending basically around Christmas, when a scientific body in Copenhagen made a pretty decisive judgment on whether Cook's proofs were sufficient to show that he had been there. And this whole time, so many crazy plot twists were happening. I don't know how much to give away. People were having public arguments in Montana lecture halls. People were throwing on hats to disguise themselves and fleeing town to get away from journalists chasing them around New York. All kinds of stuff was going on, and just the number of twists kept this story in the headlines for many months.
I mean, we're so high level. I'm not even worried about giving away too many details, because for every one we give, there's another 100.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Let's ask the question. Did Cook or did Peary get to the North Pole?
In my opinion, neither of them made it. And I'm not going out on a huge limb there, to be totally honest. Other people who've studied this very closely have come to the same conclusion. Of course, other people have come to different conclusions. I am interested in when people study the tiny little details of what was in the diaries and how the sextant readings would have worked and the travel times, and really get deep into the weeds of these things. I'm always interested in what are the affiliations and sort of loyalties of the people doing that research. And a lot of, over the years, people looking at this have had sort of a horse in the race in one way or another. But some people have not. And in fact, some of the people who looked really closely at this came into it kind of wanting, I think, to find one thing to be true and have then found another thing, the other thing to be true. And I really respect those conclusions because I think those are the people who followed the facts and they kind of went against their own interests in a way in order to publish what they thought was the truth. I value that much more highly than the conclusions of someone who was very intimate with Frederick Cook and his family, or someone who was in the Navy with Peary or something like that. I think these loyalties and affiliations are always important to kind of look at when you're trying to weigh the judgments that are being brought to this bizarre scandal and this very tangled case of who got to the pole and who didn't.
And you say this in the book too. We also will never know 100% because, listen, they were both probably doctoring whatever the heck they were doing, but it also seems like they both might have been confused about where they were. So, I mean, they might have gone over the freaking North Pole and didn't realize it, especially because, and I don't think, if you don't read a lot of Arctic literature, it's hard to understand the ice is constantly moving. It's not Antarctica, which is actually land. When you're up in the North Pole, the ice is moving. There are so many different measurements you need to take, and especially Cook seems to be much more sloppy. Peary should have been less sloppy, but Cook was very, very sloppy. It's one of those, I'm 90% sure neither of them did, but there's a weird chance that they might have done it by mistake and didn't really realize it.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the people who looked this very closely, I think it did great work, is a polar explorer named Wally Herbert, and he idolized Peary. I get the sense he wanted Peary to have made it, and then he came to the conclusion that he didn't. And Wally Herbert put it really nicely. He said, at the very least, Peary failed to provide the sort of clear evidence he made it that justified all the honors and awards he got. It's like, there's a standard there. If you want to claim the riches and the trophies of having done something, you need to sort of hit a standard of evidence, and Peary failed to do that when you actually are able to look at all the evidence he had, which people were not able to do for decades. It took decades and decades and decades to be able to look at his notes and his travel diaries in a sort of neutral environment, let's say. Your point about the North Pole is a very good one. I probably should have made it earlier. Yeah, the navigational challenges of getting there and knowing that you were there were huge, huge, and obviously a big component of this. And the comparison with the South Pole could not be more dramatic because, as you say, the South Pole is a point of land. And also, I explain this to people who don't know a ton about the history of Arctic exploring. Sometimes they say, oh, the North Pole, is that Amundsen, Scott, Shackleton? It's like, those guys are all the South Pole. And the story of the South Pole being reached, it's a classic old-time explorer's tale about grit and ingenuity and honor and tragedy and self-sacrifice. There's so many of the sort of noble emotions at play in that tale of Amundsen and Scott reaching the South Pole. The North Pole, to me, is this weird, dark comedy. It's like a Coen Brothers movie. Like, no one's the good guy. We don't really know what happened. It's a completely different vibe. And again, it feels more modern to me. And that's why I really gravitated towards it. But yeah, the South Pole, like, Amundsen got there. There's no doubt he got there. He left a tent and a letter for Scott to receive when Scott got there. So then Scott did get there. He saw the stuff that Amundsen had left behind. Scott, this is no spoiler to say, tragically died, and everyone in his party died on the way back, but left his diaries in which he recorded a lot of stuff, and people were able to read those diaries. There was very little doubt about anything in that story. There was just a lot of emotions and sort of like operatic drama. North Pole Story is all about this sort of postmodern doubt and uncertainty and fake news and sort of subjectivity and who do you believe and who do you don't. Completely different vibe.
Yeah, if you're looking at the scale of Arctic and Antarctic explorers, you got the OGs, you got Shackleton, you got Amundsen, and then we got Peary and Cook on the other side of this. Which it's sad too, because both of them, Cook was on these other things, Peary was on the other things. Peary lost parts of his body because he was trying so hard, and they both ruined everything. They had solid careers for what they were doing, but they both completely ruined it with this, right?
Yeah, their own legacies really took a huge hit from this North Pole thing. To be fair, it took a while because for a long time, a lot of people thought Peary had made it for sure. And he was kind of lionized. I mean, look, I grew up in Maine. He's a great Maine hero. He's a native Mainer, one of our most famous, Mainers. So it's only fairly recently that people start to revise their idea of Peary. And especially Cook had done really incredible things before this sort of North Pole catastrophe and should be remembered for them. And he was an incredible writer. And I'm not being facetious about this. I think you can read his works and really be enthralled by them, even if you think some of it's fiction. Just kind of treat it as fiction. He's a wonderful writer. He's such an engaging voice. He's a genuinely curious figure. And I think he had a lot of the artist in him. It was sort of in conflict with the fundraising needs involved in being an explorer. He operated sort of funnily in the world. He was sort of an interesting creative spirit who went too far. And his legacy really did take a bit of a hit. And so you mentioned Shackleton. I think Shackleton, to me, is the polar explorer who's most sort of lustily celebrated today for his heroism. And rightly so. He's seen as this incredible leader, just the sort of apotheosis of good leadership in tough conditions. But at the time, that great story of him saving everyone from the Endurance, at the time, no one cared because they had World War I going on, And I think it was it Churchill? Some high figure in the Admiralty sort of had this terse telegram for him when he came back. It was basically like, what were you doing mucking about in the Antarctic for 3 years? We need you to actually do something useful, So it's taken time for us to revise our opinion of Shackleton and really sort of treat him as this figure, whereas he was not seen like that in his day. And similarly, Peary's reputation has completely changed. And I would add, I think an interesting thing that's got a lot more attention in the last 20 years or so is the role of Matthew Henson. So Matthew Henson was Peary's black assistant for many years, and in his own time was overlooked for reasons of racism, basically. He was not very well educated and really couldn't write his own stories in the way that someone like Peary could. So that also held him back. But people have done research on him more recently and really helped to, reveal what an amazing figure he was. He was probably the best non-Inuit driver of sled dogs in the world. And this is a black man in the 1890s, who's the son of freed slaves, grew up in Maryland, and he's done this incredible life for himself against all the odds, serving under Peary and being sort of, treated poorly by Peary in some ways, but also getting this incredible set of experiences because he's attached himself to the leading Arctic explorer of America. And, Henson's gotten, I think there's certainly some film and TV projects in the works about him, justly so.
And it's always funny when you take a step back from any Arctic or Antarctic story and you talk about this perseverance, and then you stop for a second and think, yeah, but the Inuit live there. This stuff that we're talking, this was so tough on them, they were doing this. It's like, yeah, dude, they live there. Like, they figured out how to do it. And I think it's darkly poetic that, and let's just say it, any of these white explorers, if they didn't learn from the Inuit, they were going to die. Simple as that, because they knew how to do it. And if you wanted to be arrogant about it, you were going to end up in a very, very bad place.
Yes. And the British especially learned that the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
Peary, to his credit, understood that you had to learn. I wouldn't say he treated the native peoples that well, but he had this sort of funny form of respect for them insofar as he understood you needed to do it their way with American money thrown into the mix in order to get there. What is getting there? Going to the North Pole. The Inuit had this idea of like going to the North Pole is pointless. Why would you do that? It's risky. It's far away from our hunting grounds. There's no point. And Peary sort of badgered and bribed them into helping him. And you're quite right to say he never would have gotten close without their help.
I wish there was actually Inuit journals that they would write the truth and be like, he showed up again. North freaking Pole with this guy. I don't know what the hell is wrong with him. We're just trying to find a freaking seal so we can live. But he wants to go on a little jaunt because he wants to get to this imaginary thing on the top of the earth. Well, listen, I think we beat up on enough of them for right now. But Darrell, the book's fantastic. But there are people, and they're wrong, I know that. There are people who are like, this is history. I don't read history. History is boring. It's a class I had to take in high school. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I read Battle of Ink and Ice? What would you say?
Well, because it's beautifully written.
It is. It's true. It is true. I agree.
No, that's not the answer to your question. The answer is I think in this particular case, what's fascinating is the risk tolerance was so high back in those days. The things people were willing to do in order to achieve the North Pole, get their family out of poverty, get themselves out of poverty, make a name for themselves, get their expedition members back alive from the North Pole. Stuff people don't do today, in my opinion, at least, in America, people who are comfortable and well off. I just find that life or death sort of scenario, the fact that it was always there and they're doing these travels and are comfortable enough to sort of live with that life or death thing on a fairly regular basis is just amazing and inspiring. As someone who likes camping in a tent once in a while, but I'm certainly not going to put my life at risk in the way these guys did. I honestly respect it. I don't know. That's maybe sort of an unfashionable view to take of these guys who basically chose to take risks rather than being forced to do it. But the drama of all that is really just fabulous. And it makes these stories these guys tell and the stories other people wrote about them hard to put down while I was doing the research. So I really love that. So I would put it this way. This is a story about newspapers, North Pole explorers. The North Pole explorers are from a past that feels different from today. The newspaper guys are from a time that feels just like today. So I think there's sort of two sides to the history of this tale that are compelling in different ways. And I hope I successfully sort of put them together in one book.
Yeah, absolutely did. You killed it. Darrell, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Darrell, thank you so much for coming on. Battle of Ink and Ice. Get it, everybody. Fantastic book. You're going to love it. In the meantime, hit us up Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Listen to episodes of the podcast. Leave us ratings. Leave us comments. We want to hear from you nerds, and those ratings really, really help us. Until next time, stay cool.
History.